In this section, I've got some really good news and some bad news. So the good news is that we get to put together our configuration for the Redis deployment that's going to manage a single Redis pod. The bad news is that that means we have to write out 2 more configuration files, very similar to the ones we've already put together. So I know writing out all these configuration files is getting very tedious, but we're almost at the end here. We just have to do the Redis deployment, its cluster IP service, and then the same thing for Postgres and its service as well. And then after that, we're done with these very repetitive config files, and we get to look at some more interesting config files that are going to do some more interesting things inside of our cluster. So let's get to it. We're going to create our deployment config file for Redis and its associated cluster IP service. All right, inside of my code editor, I'll find my K8s directory, and inside there, I'll make a new file called Redis deployment.yaml. So we're going to start off first with the deployment. Now the deployment that we're going to put together is going to look essentially identical to the other ones that we've already written so far. So let's get through it as quickly as we can, but do make sure that you type out everything correctly because any little typo is going to eventually result in some error message down the line. All right, so I'll do an API version of apps v1. I'll give this object a type of deployment. I'll set up a metadata that's going to provide a name of Redis deployment, and then we'll start putting together some configuration that's going to exactly configure how the deployment is created and how it behaves. So for my spec, I'm going to give a replicas of 1. We only want to have 1 single copy of Redis at any given time. Now Redis is very interesting in that we can set it up in a sort of cluster mode where there will be multiple copies of Redis that kind of communicate with each other and enhance the overall stability and throughput of our application. But this is, of course, much more about Kubernetes than it is about Redis. So we're not going to worry about setting up Redis in any sort of like cluster mode or anything like that. So we're just going to have 1 standalone copy of Redis. All right, we'll also give it a selector. It's going to look for any set of pods out there that has a label of component Redis. I'll then unindent back out to be on the same indentation level as selector, and we'll provide our pod template. So for the pod template, we want to give it some metadata. Notably, we want it to have a set of labels of component Redis, like so. I'm then going to unindent again so that I'm on the same indentation level as metadata, and we'll provide the pod a spec. So it's going to have a single container, but remember the keyword right here is containers, plural, even though we only have 1. So we'll give this thing a name of Redis. It's going to use the image Redis. No Docker ID required this time, like your Docker ID / because we don't have our own custom version of Redis. We are using the copy that is included in the public repository over on Docker Hub. We'll then set up the different ports that need to be mapped to the container. In the case of Redis, the default port that it uses is 6379. And there's really no good reason for us to try to change that. Totally fine to use the default port. So I'll set up a container port of 6379, like so. All right, again, I gotta ask you, please double check all the indentation and all the spelling inside this file, because if anything inside of here is wrong, like any little typo whatsoever is going to eventually result in an error message. Like literally, if I change anything inside of here, like if I delete a P in component or something like that, something down the line is not going to work as expected. So please double check your spelling inside this file. All right, so that's the deployment. So we're now going to create a cluster IP so that our server pods and the multi-worker pod can eventually connect to this Redis instance that's running inside of the pod, inside of a container, inside of the pod. So back inside of my code editor, I'll find my K8s directory. I'm going to make a new file called Redis cluster IP service.yaml. And then inside of here, we'll put together the config to make a new cluster IP service. And again, it's going to be identical to the other ones we've already put together. So let's get through this quickly as well. We'll do our API version of v1. We are making a service. It's going to have metadata with a name of Redis service. Actually, I think that, what was the terminology we've been using? Cluster IP service. Let's make sure that we stay very consistent here. So I'll do Redis cluster IP service, like so. I'll then give it a spec with a type of cluster IP. We'll make sure that we provide the selector so that this service knows what set of pods it is managing access to. So it's going to be component Redis. And then finally, we need to designate what set of ports this service is going to manage. So I'll say ports. Any outside object that is trying to get at our Redis pod is going to access this thing on port 6379. And then after it goes through the service, we're just going to let it stick with 6379 and have that port be what it connects to inside of our container. So I'll do a target port of 6379 as well, like so. Again, no good reason to try to redirect the ports here. There are situations where you would want to do that. For example, if we have an Nginx server that is supposed to be serving up web traffic on like port 80 or something like that, but for whatever reason we have configured Nginx to listen on port 3000, which is actually something we kind of did on the React application, but the React application is not directly receiving traffic. It's kind of backed behind that ingress thing that we're going to eventually set up as well. But if that were the case, then we could do that little bit of port redirection and not have to reconfigure our image or anything like that. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Now the last thing I want to do is load this up into kubectl as well with the apply command. So I'll flip back over to my terminal. There's the k8s directory. I'll do a kubectl apply-f k8s. We're just going to throw everything inside there. We should probably see a bunch of different objects that are going to end up unchanged, like so. But then the two new config files that we just made will be reflected as objects created inside this log. And so just as before, we can do a quick get pods and verify that, yep, we've got a single copy of Redis up and running. And we can also do a get services and verify that our Redis cluster IP service is up and running as well on port 6379. Okay, so this looks good. Now we've only got one last set of config files for Postgres, along with this associated cluster IP. So let's get through that in the last section. I know this stuff is so tedious with all this writing of identical files, but we're almost done with that. So let's finish up these last two config files in the next section, and then we get back to some more interesting topics in the world of Kubernetes. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.